Imagine you are the heir to one of Europe's oldest banking dynasties. You have just turned 30. You sit across from your grandfather, a man who has witnessed 3 recessions, 2 world wars filtered through the lens of generational wealth, and the quiet collapse of a dozen fortunes he once envied. He looks at you and says, "Next year, you disappear." Not a punishment, not an exile, a prescription. For 12 months, you will read, reflect, travel without agenda, and speak to almost no one in the family's professional circle. You will produce nothing measurable. You will make no deals. You will not attend board meetings. And when you return, you will be expected to arrive with something the family's advisors cannot buy, synthesize, or manufacture: clarity of mind and singularity of vision. This is not fiction. This practice, a mandated structured withdrawal from the noise of wealth management, business, and social obligation, has been observed, documented, and quietly passed down across some of the world's most enduring dynastic families. The Rothschilds, certain branches of the Rockefellers, ancient merchant dynasties across Florence, Amsterdam, and Kyoto, and less publicly, among ultra-high net worth families in Switzerland, Lebanon, and Hong Kong, whose names you will never see in Forbes, but whose fortunes have compounded quietly across centuries. Today, we're going to explore why they do it, what science and history tell us about the practice, and what it means for anyone, regardless of their net worth, who is serious about building something that outlasts them. The problem with perpetual motion. To understand why old money mandates stillness, you first have to understand the disease it's treating. Modern wealth culture, especially new money, is addicted to motion. The calendar packed with meetings, the inbox that never empties, the constant signaling of busyness as proof of value. There is an almost universal assumption in entrepreneurial and corporate circles that the person who works most, travels most, and sleeps least is the person who deserves to win most. Old money dynasties look at this and see a trap, not because hard work is wrong, but because unexamined hard work is catastrophic at scale. Here is what they observed across generations. Families that never stopped, that chased every opportunity, reacted to every market shift, attended every social obligation, and kept their principal heirs in a constant state of productive noise, tended to make one of 2 mistakes. The first mistake is drift. Without regular periods of deep reflection, family strategy drifts. The original thesis, the specific competitive advantage that built the wealth, gets diluted by the noise of day-to-day management. A banking family starts making real estate bets. A textile dynasty diversifies into technology it doesn't understand. Each individual decision looks reasonable. The cumulative effect is strategic incoherence. The second mistake is succession blindness. The heir who never stops is never properly formed. They inherit responsibilities before they've developed a philosophy. They manage assets before they've understood values. And when a true crisis arrives, a war, a market collapse, a generational handoff, they react rather than respond. Reactivity at the scale of dynastic wealth is ruinous. The mandated period of strategic solitude was the old money solution to both problems. But here's what makes it especially interesting from a scientific standpoint. These dynasties arrived at this prescription centuries before neuroscience could explain why it works. They did it empirically, by watching families succeed and fail across generations. The brains, the data, the evidence came later. The pattern came first. The historical record. Let's go to the historical evidence, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. The Rothschild model. The Rothschild family is perhaps the most studied dynasty in financial history. Founded by Mayer Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt in the late 18th century, the family built what became the largest private fortune in the world by the 19th century, with banking houses operating simultaneously in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Naples, and Vienna. 5 brothers, 5 cities, 1 strategy. What most people don't discuss is the extraordinary emphasis placed on intellectual retreat within the Rothschild family structure. Mayer Amschel himself was deeply steeped in Talmudic tradition and the practice of dedicated study, extended periods withdrawn from commerce for the purpose of cultivating wisdom, ethical clarity, and perspective, was woven into the family's identity from its very foundation. This wasn't mere religiosity. It was strategic theology. The principle was straightforward. A man who thinks clearly in stillness makes better decisions in chaos. Across the family's 19th century correspondence, preserved and analyzed by historians, including Niall Ferguson, there is a recurring theme of senior family members urging younger heirs to withdraw from the city, to read, to travel slowly and without commercial purpose, and to return only when they had something new to say about the world. Nathan Rothschild, arguably the most commercially aggressive of the brothers, nonetheless maintained a practice of what his letters describe as weeks of account, periods where he would pull back entirely from markets to assess the broader landscape. The Florentine merchant dynasties go back further to 15th century Florence, and you encounter the Medici family, whose patronage of the arts was not merely aesthetic indulgence, but a calculated form of civilizational positioning. Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch who transformed the family from wealthy merchants into the de facto rulers of Florence, was a voracious reader and philosopher who saw the intellectual retreat, the retiro, as inseparable from financial leadership. The Platonic Academy Cosimo founded and funded in Florence was not charity. It was a long-term investment in the kind of thinking that shapes epochs. By surrounding himself and his heirs with the deepest thinkers of the Renaissance and mandating immersion in that world, Cosimo ensured that the Medici didn't just respond to the world, they shaped the categories through which the world was understood. This is a key distinction that runs through all of these dynasties. The solitude is not passive. It is generative. The withdrawal from noise is paired with a deliberate immersion in ideas, history, and philosophy. You are not simply resting, you are reprogramming. Japanese merchant families, the Omi merchants across the world, in feudal Japan, a class of merchants known as the Omi shonin, merchants from the Shiga prefecture, developed a philosophy of commerce so enduring that its principles are still taught in Japanese business schools today. Their guiding philosophy was Sampo Yoshi, good for the seller, good for the buyer, good for society. But less discussed is the Omi merchant's emphasis on MA, the Japanese concept of negative space, of meaningful pause, both in aesthetics and in business practice. The most respected Omi merchant houses institutionalized periods of withdrawal. A senior merchant who had been active in markets for a decade was expected to take what was essentially a sabbatical, traveling the provinces, not to sell, but to observe. What did ordinary people need? What was changing in the landscape? What had the merchant himself become in the heat of commerce? And was that person still aligned with the family's long-term philosophy? When he returned, he was expected to deliver not a financial report, but something closer to a philosophical reckoning, a statement of where the family stood in relation to the world and where it should stand a generation hence. The Swiss private banking tradition. More contemporaneously, the great Swiss private banking families, houses like Lombard Odier, Pictet, and Mirabeau, some of which date back to the late 1700s, developed what is effectively an institutionalized version of this practice. The partnership structures of these banks have historically required that senior partners step back from day-to-day management at regular intervals. This was partly about succession planning and partly about what one Pictet partner described in a 1990s interview as the obligation to think beyond the current generation. The bank must outlive every banker in it, and that requires regular self-examination at the highest levels. The neuroscience of strategic stillness. Now let's bring the science in, because the convergence between what ancient dynasties practiced and what modern neuroscience has discovered is striking. The default mode network. For most of human history, the brain's resting state was considered scientifically uninteresting. The brain doing nothing while you daydreamed or stared at a wall. Then, in the early 2000s, neuroscientist Marcus Rachel at Washington University discovered something remarkable. The brain is never truly off. When you cease directed tasks, a specific network of brain regions, now called the default mode network, or DMN, lights up with intense activity. The DMN is associated with self-referential thinking, prospective memory, imagining the future, moral reasoning, narrative construction, and what researchers call autobiographical planning, the deep work of understanding who you are, what you value, and where you are going. Here is the critical insight. The DMN is suppressed during focused, goal-directed work. The harder you push, the more productive you appear to the outside world, the less your brain is able to do this deeper processing. The constant meetings, the full inbox, the packed schedule, they don't just tire you. They structurally prevent the kind of thinking that strategic clarity requires. When old money dynasties mandate a year of solitude, they are, without knowing the neuroscience, mandating a year of default mode network activation. They are giving the heirs brain the one thing it cannot access during ordinary productive life: sustained, uninterrupted time for deep self-examination and strategic synthesis. Memory consolidation and the long view. A second critical neuroscientific mechanism is memory consolidation. Research by neuroscientist Leela Devachi at Columbia University and others has shown that memory consolidation, the process of integrating new experiences with existing knowledge to form stable, accessible, long-term memories, is heavily dependent on rest and mentally undemanding time. This has enormous implications for strategy. A person who has been in constant motion for a decade accumulates enormous amounts of experience, but that experience is never fully integrated. It sits in episodic memory, accessible in fragments, but not truly consolidated into the kind of wisdom that can be deliberately applied. The year of solitude, if properly structured, allows a decade of compressed experience to be finely understood, not just recalled. The heir who returns from 12 months of reading, reflection, and slow travel is not the same person who left. Neurologically, they have a genuinely different brain, one in which the experiences of the previous decade have been woven into a coherent, accessible understanding of the world. The suppression of status anxiety. There's a third mechanism, and it may be the most important one from a dynastic perspective. What psychologist Henri Tajfel and later researchers on social comparison theory have shown is that status-competitive environments distort judgment. When you are surrounded by peers, rivals, and stakeholders, when your decisions are constantly visible to people who will evaluate you, you systematically bias toward short-term legibility over long-term wisdom. You make decisions that look good. You pursue strategies that can be explained in a meeting. You avoid risks that might embarrass you, even if they're correct. In status-competitive environments, optics and outcomes diverge, and optics win. The year of solitude removes the status audience. There is no one watching. There is no one to impress. The heir must confront the actual world, their actual values, their actual competencies, their actual fears, without the social scaffolding that ordinarily shapes every choice they make. This is profoundly disorienting for the first several months, and then, according to those who have experienced versions of it, it becomes the most clarifying experience of a life. What happens during the year? So what does this actually look like in practice? Based on historical accounts, documented family traditions, and contemporary adaptations, the strategic solitude year tends to follow a rough structure, though the most sophisticated families understand that rigid prescription defeats the purpose. The first quarter, disorientation and detoxification. The first 3 months are reportedly the hardest. The heir arrives at their place of retreat, historically a family estate in a rural location, a monastery, a rented house in a foreign city, and immediately confronts something unexpected: the withdrawal symptoms of productivity culture. Without meetings to attend, decisions to make, or performances to deliver, a profound anxiety typically sets in. What am I doing? Am I falling behind? What are others thinking of my absence? This disorientation is not a flaw in the system. It is the system working. The dynasties that have practiced this longest recognize that the anxiety itself is diagnostic. It reveals how much of the heir's identity had been constructed from external validation rather than internal conviction. The prescription for this phase is simple and demanding. Read. Specifically, history. The great dynastic families universally prescribed immersion in historical texts, not management books or contemporary finance, but the long sweep of civilizational history: Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, the long biographies of great figures who had built and lost empires. The purpose is to recalibrate the time scale. A person in the middle of the market cannot see a century. The first quarter of solitude is the forcible installation of a longer lens. The second quarter, physical and intellectual expansion. The second phase typically involves deliberate physical engagement with the world, but on different terms than before. Not the whirlwind business trip, but the slow journey. Walking the land, traveling through regions the heir has never visited, specifically regions characterized by a different relationship with wealth and time. Spending time with craftspeople, farmers, teachers, and others whose lives are structured around mastery rather than accumulation. This phase is about developing what the Florentine humanists called sprezzatura, not the superficial elegance often associated with the term, but its deeper meaning, the ease that comes from having genuinely internalized a wide range of human experience. An heir who has only ever encountered wealth is, in a specific and consequential sense, impoverished. The second quarter remedies this. Simultaneously, this phase involves intensive intellectual engagement, not passive reading, but active intellectual creation. Journaling extensively, drafting long essays on the family's history, philosophy, and competitive position. Identifying what the heir actually believes, as distinct from what they have been told to believe. The third quarter, strategic re-engagement. By the third quarter, something notable tends to occur. The heir begins to want to engage with the world strategically, but on their own terms. They begin to identify the questions that matter to them, not the questions assigned by the family business, but the questions that arise from their own deepest thinking. Where is the world going? What is the family's relationship to that direction? What is genuinely worth building? This is the phase where many heirs arrive at the most important realizations of their professional lives. Precisely because they are not in the market, they can observe it with a clarity unavailable to those inside it. Some of the most consequential decisions in dynastic wealth history have been conceived during periods of deliberate withdrawal. Positions built, industries entered or exited, alliances formed or ended, not because the heir was watching the data more carefully, but because they had finally developed the clarity to see what the data meant. The fourth quarter, integration and re-entry. The final phase is preparation for return, not the resumption of old habits, but the deliberate construction of a new operating framework. The heir articulates, in writing, in depth, what they now understand that they did not understand before, what they will do differently, what they refuse to do that they previously accepted, what they see as the family's most important challenge in the decade ahead. This document, which in various family traditions takes the form of a letter, a memorandum, or an extended personal essay, becomes the strategic foundation for the following decade's work. It is not a business plan. It is a philosophical declaration, and it is taken profoundly seriously by the family's senior members, who understand that the quality of thinking it contains is the direct product of everything the Solitude was designed to produce. The modern relevance. You do not need to be a Rothschild or a Medici to take this seriously. In fact, the absence of this practice in modern professional life may be one of the most significant hidden costs of contemporary culture. Consider what we know about the highest performing individuals across history. Newton developed calculus and the theory of universal gravitation during the 18 months he spent in quarantine at his family's farm during the Great Plague of 1665, isolated from the stimulus and social noise of Cambridge. Darwin spent 5 years on the Beagle, physically removed from the expectations and assumptions of the scientific establishment before returning with a theory that rewrote biology. Churchill wrote millions of words during his years in the political wilderness of the 1930s, and those years of enforced reflection produced the strategic clarity that made him an irreplaceable war leader. These are not coincidences. They are the same mechanism the dynasties understood, that the world's most important ideas, decisions, and orientations cannot be reached in the middle of the noise. They require withdrawal, synthesis, and the kind of unhurried thinking that the pace of modern professional life systematically prevents. The question is not whether you can afford a full year of solitude. Most people cannot, and that is a real constraint. The question is whether you are building any version of this practice into your life at all. The most successful people operating in modern business, and I'm talking about the ones building multi-generational impact, not the ones optimizing quarterly metrics, tend to have developed informal versions of the old money practice. The annual week-long solo retreat, the quarterly no meetings, no output day, the sabbatical after a major professional chapter closes, the morning journaling practice that serves as a daily micro-withdrawal. These are not the full dynastic prescription, but they are expressions of the same principle, that the clearest thinking happens in deliberate stillness. and that stillness must be protected against the enormous cultural pressure to be perpetually productive. One framework worth borrowing directly from the dynastic model is what we might call the decade-end review. Every 10 years, at the close of a significant chapter of work and before the beginning of the next, spend at least 1 month in the kind of intensive reflective practice the dynasties describe. Read the history of your industry the way a historian would read it, not the way a practitioner does. Write the long essay about what you actually believe, not what you've been performing. Identify the assumptions that have been governing your decisions and test each one against the evidence of the decade just past. This is not self-help. This is strategic hygiene at the level that separates families and individuals who build enduring legacies from those who build impressive but fragile peaks. The deeper lesson. There is a final observation that runs beneath all of this, and it is perhaps the most important one. The practice of strategic solitude is, at its deepest level, an expression of a particular relationship with time. Old money thinks in generations, not quarters, not years, not even decades, but generations. And when you think in generations, your relationship with the present moment changes entirely. The urgent pressures of the current market become less urgent. The social performance of busyness becomes less compelling. The temptation to optimize for what can be measured becomes less powerful. In its place emerges something rarer and more valuable: the capacity to ask the questions that no algorithm can answer. What kind of family do we want to be? What does it mean to steward wealth responsibly across time? What is worth building that will still matter 100 years from now? These are not practical questions in the ordinary sense. They cannot be answered in a meeting. They cannot be optimized by a consultant. They arise only in stillness, and they are answered only by people who have made a practice of stillness. The dynasties that last are not necessarily the ones with the best investment managers or the most sophisticated tax structures. They are the ones whose heirs have been given, systematically and repeatedly, the extraordinary gift of time to think, to read, to examine, to form genuine convictions about what they are doing and why. In a world that is accelerating toward increasingly frenetic motion, where attention is monetized, distraction is engineered, and busyness is the default currency of status, the practice of deliberate withdrawal is not a luxury. It is an act of resistance. And for those who take it seriously, it is one of the most powerful competitive advantages available. The old money dynasties knew this centuries before we had the vocabulary to explain it. They built the practice into the architecture of their families and their fortunes. And the families that are still standing, still compounding, still coherent, still relevant after generations of turbulence, are in no small part still standing because of it. So let me leave you with this. The next time you feel guilty for not being productive, the next time you resist taking a week alone to read and think, the next time the culture of perpetual motion makes you feel that stillness is a form of weakness, remember that the oldest, most enduring fortunes in human history were built and maintained by people who understood something that most of the modern world has forgotten. The deepest work is not visible. The most important decisions are not made in meetings. And the clarity that allows a person or a family to navigate decades and generations of complexity does not come from working harder. It comes from thinking deeper. And thinking deeper requires something that cannot be scheduled between 2 and 3 on a Tuesday afternoon. It requires silence and the courage to sit in it long enough for something real to emerge. If you found this exploration valuable, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover wealth, history, philosophy, and the hidden principles behind long-term success every week. And leave a comment below. What would your year of strategic solitude look like? Where would you go? What would you read? I genuinely want to know. Until next time.